Respiration physiology. I'll start with a question, and I want you to think about this. I will actually ask this in class. So be able to reflect on how you believe age, exercise, muscle weakness, and illness will have an impact on respiratory function. On this slide, you'll see that when we think about breaths per minute, according to age, there's quite a range. So when looking at the pediatric number of breaths per minute, it's quite high as comparison to an adult. Why do you think a newborn would have such a high number of breaths per minute in comparison to an adult? And you can see also that the number of breaths per minute for a newborn, 40 to 70 breaths per minute, also contrasts with an infant, a younger child, and one who is preteen to early teen years. Now, I do want you to be able to recognize that number, those numbers. It may be on a multiple choice question, but also understand the significance of why there's such a big difference there. This slide lists some factors that relate to the properties or the physiology of respiration. So remember we looked at the ribs and we thought about the rib cage and how it rises up and how the ribs actually move out like Venetian blinds. So the torque and the twisting of the ribs is important because when you think about the outward torque or twisting, when you twist something up, it will just naturally come back to its position. So you also get that twisting that occurs, and then it wants to, go back to not being in a twisted position. So that's what we mean by torque as being a force in respiration that is to be considered. Obviously, the elasticity, that we're stretching the lungs as well as the abdominal muscles. So the fact that you do have the capacity to increase the volume, and that's important, but also the fact that it can go back to its original size is important as well. And I already mentioned gravity in the last, in our last lectures, because we know that gravity helps everything return to its place on exhalation. There are some tools that can be used to measure respiration, and the spirometer is one. And that's a test that you may have taken if you ever had any issues with breathing or asthma, where in a doctor's office they may have had you blow into a tube, and that tube, a spirometer, can measure lung capacity, respiratory flow, and lung volume. There's also something called an incentive spirometer, and that's something that may be used if you are hospitalized. If a person is hospitalized, you may see a device that is used to exercise or to force a person to take deep breaths by using that device. Now I have video clips that will show you both of those, but I'm going to post those up separately so that you can review spirometers. So in respiration, there are 4 different stages. There's ventilation, and if you recall, when we talked about a person who may not be able to breathe on their own, the machine that they're hooked up to is called a ventilator. A lot of people will mistakenly call it a respirator, but it's actually a ventilator, and its purpose is to move air in the respiratory pathways. The other is with ventilation, so movement of air, but then that air is distributed to all the alveoli. And I didn't have the number in my head, but here it is, 300 million, so there are quite a lot of those. And then you have perfusion, which brings the oxygen to the capillaries, and then diffusion is that gas exchange. So remember we talked about the oxygen in, the carbon dioxide out. And that occurs cross-alveolar capillary membrane. And you can see in this picture here that we've seen before, this is where this gas exchange occurs. Now, on the next part, I'm going to show you different volumes and capacities. And I want you to be able to match the definitions with the volumes and capacities that you see. But first we start with what volume is. We've seen that before. And then you will see some specifically named capacities and volumes. So a capacity is, you can see here, that that's going to be a functional measure, and you'll understand in a minute. And the volumes and capacities will vary. There will be some variation, and that will depend on body size, gender, age, and height. So if you look at a person who is very petite, very small, if you think about really the rib cage, because that is the area that can be expanded. So small versus large, you'll notice that people are obviously different sizes, and you will see some variation there. In terms of age, there may be some reduction in volume that could occur, and could occur with advanced age, but then you also have to think about the volumes and capacity with young age, just as we looked at the breaths per minute going across different ages. Height, again, leads to thinking about the actual size of the thoracic cavity. So if somebody is super tall versus somebody who's much shorter, obviously the volume of the thoracic cavity and the the amount of air that they could actually take in one breath is going to be different. All right, so here are some terms that you will need to remember and be able to match. So respiratory cycle is there, and typically I draw on the board when I do this, but there will be a video clip that has some drawings in it. But that's your in and out, and I actually did draw that on the board when I talked about the percent of time you inhale versus exhale when you are just doing vegetative breathing versus speaking. So you can remember that I drew sort of that wave on the board. Now, here's a definition that you need to know. Tidal volume. So what is tidal volume? So that's the volume of air remaining in the lungs after a maximum exhalation. So as you're doing vegetative breathing, you're taking air in and out, but then you can further blow out air, and the air that's remaining in the lungs will be your tidal volume. Again, bear with me, so hopefully watching the video clip after will be helpful. The inspiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that can be inhaled after a tidal inspiration. So if you're sitting there with quiet breathing, then you are not breathing in as much air as you can. Remember that as you're sitting there, just doing quiet breathing, I've often said that, as you're sitting there, I can ask you to take in a deep breath, and the deep breath that you take in, that extra air above your just quiet breathing, is inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, so as you're sitting there with quiet breathing, that would be your tidal inspiration, expiration. So then if I told you to blow out all the air that you could blow out, so that would be the volume of air that's expired following your passive tidal expiration. That is your expiratory reserve volume. Residual volume. So that just means that after you have blown out all the air that you can, there's still air in your lungs. Why? Because your lungs remain in that closed thoracic cavity, and they don't collapse and go flat when you exhale. So there's still some air that's there. And then in the conducting passageways, so for example, in the trachea, there is a volume of air that is always there and does not change. So that is considered dead space air. Now, you take the volumes that we looked at, and then you can come up with measures that are called capacities. So the first is the vital capacity. You can see the definition here. I'm still going to read it out. Volume that can be inhaled after a maximum exhalation. So this means that if I told you to blow out all the air that you can blow out, and then I ask you to inhale all the air that you can, that would be vital capacity. Now, the little acronyms that you see, VC, that's vital capacity, equals IRV. That was from a previous slide, remember? Inspiratory reserve volume. Sorry, I probably should have put the acronym there, but you'll notice that golden bullet. That's your IRV. So vital capacity equals inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume. Again, that was back on the previous slide, expiratory reserve volume. The functional residual capacity is the volume of air in the body at the end of passive exhalation. So again, if you're sitting there and just taking a quiet breath, not forcing it out, you have air that's remaining there, and that's called your functional residual capacity, which is your expiratory reserve volume, because you didn't blow out all the air, and your residual volume. Again, I flip back to the other slide so that you could see that. Your total lung capacity is IC plus FRC. Now, what does that mean? IC is inspiratory capacity, which is there, and then the FRC was your functional residual capacity. And the inspiratory capacity is the maximum inspiratory volume possible after a tidal expiration. So this is quiet breathing, that's your tidal expiration, and then your maximum inspiratory volume is you take in all the air that you can above that tidal expiration. Now there's a little video clip that will show this information and spell it out a little better. So we're going to pause here, and then I want you to take a look at that video clip and see if that helps you to understand better.
Hello, in this video we're going to talk about lung function, focusing on the 4 important lung volumes and then talk about the lung capacities. And following this video there's a follow-up on spirometry and how it relates to these values. So we begin by looking at the anatomy of the lungs. Here is the person's respiratory system, the upper and lower respiratory tract. Here are the ribs, which wrap around the lungs and help protect it. The muscular diaphragm, which plays a main role in helping with respiration, as well as the intercostal muscles. The lungs allow us to take in or inspire oxygen and remove or exhale carbon dioxide. This is an exchange. The exchange of gases occur in the building blocks, you can say, of the lungs, called the alveolus. An important calculation of lung function can be gleaned from the displacement of air volume during inspiration and or expiration. I'm going to represent the 4 important lung volumes using the alveoli as an example. This is just a concept to hopefully understand the differences in lung volumes. We're going to talk about the lung volume of a typical adult male. Adult females have slightly lower values than the ones I'll be talking about. But here, the concept is the main thing, so I hope it makes sense. The amount of air we breathe in and out in our lungs normally can be referred to as the tidal volume. Typical values of the tidal volume are on the order of 500 to 750 mils. However, we can also take a deep breath in, deep inspiration. Thus, our volume of air in our lungs can increase. This is the inspiratory reserve volume, the air inspired with a maximal inspiratory effort in excess of the tidal volume. Typically, the inspiratory reserve volume is about 3 liters. So again, we're looking at the 4 important lung volumes. Here again is an example of your tidal volume, and this is your inspiratory reserve volume. We can also exhale more than usual. The amount of air we can exhale in addition to the tidal volume is the expiratory reserve volume. This is typically 1.5 liters. Thus, at the end of the day, there is always an amount of air or volume remaining in our lungs after a maximal expiratory effort. This is the residual volume and is about 1 liter. When all 4 of the above volume components are taken together, they make up the total lung capacity, about 6 liters. And we will talk more about this later. There is this also thing called dead space. This is basically the part of the respiratory tract or part of the lungs that does not participate in gas exchange. Now let's learn more about those 4 volumes by representing it in a graph, because these volumes have important implications in health and disease. So here is a graph. On the y-axis is the lung volume in mil. Remember, our total lung volume is about 6 liters, so 6,000 mils in adult males. So let's draw it out. Going up here is when we inspire, so inspiration, and increase our lung volume, obviously. And going down the y-axis is when we exhale air, so we are decreasing our lung volume, which kind of makes sense. The x-axis is just time, nothing really specific. So let's now first recap our 4 important lung volumes. If you remember, the amount of air that moves into the lungs with each inspiration during quiet breathing is our tidal volume, typically 500 mils, 0.5 liters, just like so. Remember the dead space. We're not talking about this area because it has no role in gas exchange. Let's just say we are breathing normally and then suddenly take the biggest breath in. This is the inspiratory reserve volume and can get up to 3 liters in addition to the tidal volume. Don't worry, here I drew 1,200, but it's meant to be 3 liters. It will correct itself soon. Then let's say we breathe normally, so normal tidal volume, and then we have a maximal expiratory phase. This is the expiratory reserve volume, typically 1.5 liters. And the air left in the lungs after a maximal expiratory effort is the residual volume, which is about 1 liter. So, an adult male will typically have a total lung capacity of 6 liters. A female, 4.5 liters. Now, different textbooks have different values. Now, just like we talked about those 4 lung volumes, there are 4 lung capacities. I already introduced the total lung capacity, which is one of them. Now, let's recap the same graph containing the lung volumes again, and also introduce the lung capacities. So the amount of air that moves into the lungs with each inspiration during quiet normal breathing is called the tidal volume, about 500 mils or 0.5 liters. The air inspired with a maximal inspiratory effort in excess of the tidal volume is the inspiratory reserve volume, which is typically 3 liters. The volume expelled by an active expiratory effort after passive expiration is the expiratory reserve volume, which is about 1 liter. And of course, you have the air left in the lungs after a maximal expiratory effort, which is the residual volume, about 1 liter as well. The vital lung capacity refers to the maximum amount of air expired from a fully inflated lung, which means that it's essentially the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. These three components will give you the vital lung capacity. The maximum amount of air inspired from the end expiratory level is the inspiratory capacity, which is about 3.5 liters. So it's essentially the inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume. The functional residual capacity, which should not be mixed up with the residual volume, represents the volume of air remaining in the lungs after expiration of a normal breath. So this is essentially the residual volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. And the amount is typically 2.5 liters. Finally, the fourth lung capacity that we have already talked about is the sum of all the lung volumes, essentially. And this is the total lung capacity. Again, in the males, the total lung capacity is about 6 liters, and in females, about 4.2 liters, but different textbooks say different things. Now that we have a better understanding of the lung volumes and lung capacities, let us see how this can be used to diagnose and monitor certain lung conditions. What I mean specifically is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and also restrictive lung diseases.
Okay, so hopefully the video that you watched helped to clarify the volumes and capacities for the lungs. So this next slide mentions the pressures of the respiratory system. So pressure is important. Remember that when we talk about the physics that actually help to drive inspiration and expiration, pressure is important. Remember we talked about negative pressure or positive pressure. Excuse me. So I'm still a little bit sick with my voice here, so pardon me. But so this slide just talks about some of the different pressures that could actually be measured with equipment. Okay, my dog's trying to get me to play with the toy. Okay, just sorry about the background noise. But you can measure pressure intraorally or subglottally. Subglottal pressure means the pressure that is below the vocal folds, because the glottis is the vocal folds. You can also measure the pressure in the lung itself. That's the alveolar or pulmonic pressure. And you can also measure pressure in the pleura. So that's the pleural pressure. Now pneumothorax is the fact that remember that this is a closed system. So if you ever see on some TV show where somebody's been shot or stabbed and they say that they have a collapsed lung, somebody stabbed someone in the chest cavity and that space is actually all of a sudden now there's this hole in the thoracic cavity, and remember that this thoracic cavity was intact. So now with this hole there, air is escaping and you don't have the pressure that's needed to keep the lung stretched out, so that lung will collapse. So when you hear about a collapsed lung, it's not sorry, that's Nayla who's barking. If you hear about a collapsed lung, it's not that the lung itself is punctured, but it's the hole that's made in the thoracic cavity that disrupts the pressure. I have to pause now. Good girl. Okay, mommy has to work now. Sit. Good girl. Sit pretty. Sit pretty. Good girl. Yay. Okay. Nayla down. Good girl. Good girl. Okay, mommy has to work now. So, how does posture affect respiration? This is another question that I would like for you to think about, and then we can discuss in class. Think about whether or not you're standing up straight or hunched over or lying down even. Think about how that would affect respiratory, the respiratory process. Sorry. This slide reminds us of the respiratory cycle and how it changes for speech versus non-speech. I've mentioned this before in class, and I've drawn the wave formation on the board. This breaks it down a bit more into percentages. So when talking, you have an almost even inspiration, expiration. It's actually by the percentages a little bit more, 60% of the cycle is expiration. But when you're speaking, it's a quick inhalation, that's 10% of the cycle, and then 90% of the cycle is expiration. So remember, when we talk about these percentages, we're talking about that wave formation. Remember that thing that looks like a wave? That's the inspiration, or one cycle is air in and air out. So that's what those percentages correspond to. In order to control the outflow of air, we use muscles, and that description of what's happening there is called checking action. So the checking action is using the muscles to keep the air from just going out all at once, and instead allowing the air to be released gradually so that you can phonate. So if the air is just in and out, like sorry for the heavy breathing, but to speak, you take air in and then short inhalation, and then as you are letting air go out, you're actually using muscles to gradually allow the air to go out so that you can continue to use your the expired air for phonation. So that's what we mean by checking action. It's the use of those muscles to control the outward flow of speech. Here's some other muscle facts that are important. We had mentioned external intercostal muscles before, but this again is telling you that these are among the most significant for speech. You can read the information here that's on the screen. Okay, so it allows you to take in as much air as you need so that you can go ahead and produce that phonation and project your voice as well. Sternocleidomastoid, this is again reminding you of its use. You might be thinking about how it's, just a muscle in the neck, but you do use it for forced inspiration, so it is helping you to take air in. And right and left just means that you have that muscle on both sides of your neck. And the way that it's helping in inspiration is helping to elevate the top and the front of the rib cage, elevates the sternum and anterior rib cage. When we think about the pressures and the volumes, something to keep in mind is that speech is work. We talked about the checking action, and when we think about speech as work, this reminds us of someone, for example, who has a respiratory issue. If you've ever seen someone who's on oxygen or who has some type of respiratory disease process, they will often get very fatigued just from speaking, because as you are speaking, obviously you're coordinating that intake of breath, you're using the checking action or muscles to control the outflow of air. You're trying to speak on, normally for us, we can speak a number of words per breath, But if someone is short of breath, then they would speak fewer words per breath. So it is work, and someone who is having respiratory issues may just fatigue from talking and need to take breaks. And then you can also speak on expiratory reserve air, but it's not ideal. So as you can see now, I'm pushing all the air out and speaking more. So yeah, so that's not a good thing, but you can speak on expiratory reserve. Typically, we're just bringing it down to that tidal volume or tidal respiration, and then taking in a full breath and then speaking back to tidal expiration. But you do have that extra air. There's more air that you can blow out. But sometimes you will find people speaking on that expiratory reserve, either out of bad habit, or sometimes when someone has a respiratory disease process and they're just trying to use whatever air they can for phonation. Now, this is important, the benefit of diaphragmatic breathing versus clavicular breathing. So this is something that I want you to think about and to understand. So we've talked about, breathing from the diaphragm, how the diaphragm is the largest muscle, and that you want primarily to be using the diaphragm to get a nice big breath of air. And we do have accessory muscles that we can use, for example, the muscles that are in the clavicle, but we want to use those as accessories so that we're getting a big intake of air, using the diaphragm, expanding as much as we can, and then, you can use additional muscles. But for someone who's doing clavicular breathing, that really means that they are primarily using the muscles, in the upper chest area to pull up the upper the upper rib cage. So what happens with clavicular breathing is you can actually see it and see more movement in the upper chest. So there are disadvantages, and I think that's covered in the next slide. Yeah. So yeah, if we were talking in class, I would have just asked you, what do you think the advantages or disadvantages are? But since we have this recorded, I'll go ahead and just kind of go through this. So if you're breathing from the diaphragm, getting a nice big breath, and someone in one of the classes talked about how, in yoga class, they talk about belly breathing. So that, again, just helps you to focus on the fact that you're using the diaphragm. But that is the most efficient way. And it's important because you're getting a full expansion of the thoracic cavity. You're taking nice deep breaths. If you're taking nice deep breaths, that means that you're getting enough oxygen. So that's always a good thing, right? So those are the advantages of diaphragmatic breathing. Now with clavicular breathing, you're using shallow breaths. So this is when somebody is primarily, again, this is like primarily, using the muscles in the neck, in the chest, these accessory muscles to do that. So some of those muscles are listed here, and that's inefficient. So you're getting more elevation of the sternum, but if you're not getting this nice big expansion of the chest cavity and only elevation of the sternum, it's not very efficient. And typically with clavicular breathing, it's typically related to a pathological condition. In other words, somebody has some type of a disease process, and you can see this clavicular breathing, this upper body movement, and you might even see someone that you can actually, it looks like the shoulders are shrugging up, because they're even using the trapezius muscles, which we know are more toward the back, to sort of try to raise up that upper chest. So when we talked about pathological conditions, we want to go into a little bit more information about them. You may have seen the term COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I actually see it a lot now on commercials when they talk about medicine that you can take for that. But this is a condition that occurs Chronic means that you've had respiratory problems over a period of time. So this is chronic bronchitis or chronic emphysema. Now, many of us have had bronchitis, self included, but this is chronic. This means a condition that goes on and on and on and really never resolves or goes away. And emphysema is a specific respiratory disease process that is often the cause of COPD or the underlying diagnosis. So what happens with emphysema is that you actually have a destruction of the cilia in the bronchial passageways, and there actually is a change in the alveoli as well. So it's listed here 4 significant morphological changes. So you see the cluster of alveoli change, become a single sac. And instead of looking like this nice bunch of grapes, you see things sort of merge together. There's a picture next, so we can take a look at that. This person's going to have you. So if this is happening, you can't get enough oxygen because you have less surface area of alveoli to help get the oxygen in. And because of this, the person might be attempting to get deeper inhalations. So you might have someone who has had this respiratory disease process and they're trying to compensate for it, and you actually see where they get a barrel chest where they're just trying to pull in more air. But remember, because there are less alveoli, no matter how much they try to suck in, they're not getting as much oxygen as they need. Also, in this disease process, the diaphragm is lower at rest. So, which means that because it's already low, that you're not getting as much of a stretch and expansion of the rib cage as you normally would. And then finally, this leads to respiratory failure. So this picture shows an example of alveoli, what it would look like normally on the bottom there, and then with emphysema, how everything just sort of blurs together. Remember that each of these little sacs remember, they were covered with capillaries, and then you get that gas exchange. So you can see how that would be, devastating. And it gives you a little bit of closer look just to see the comparison. Normal healthy sacs and then with emphysema. This is showing someone, often see someone who may have an oxygen tank. This woman has a portable oxygen tank who she has to carry this with her. So often see people who have COPD, chronic respiratory problems. They've likely been suffering with them for a while, and then they need to carry oxygen because they can't really get enough on their own. I'm going to also play a little bit of a clip here. Hopefully this will work out. Bear with me for...
So how has COPD affected the quality of your life?
It's funny. Over time, gradually, I've noticed in being short of breath as first thing I recognized, I guess, is I didn't have a lot of stamina. Even when I was working and being very physical in the work that I did, I'd have to stop halfway up crawling up a ladder. And over the years, it's digressed to the point where I can't go for walks anymore, as much as I would like to. I have to take my time going downstairs, and especially coming back upstairs. I can't do the things that I used to love to do: play golf, ride motorcycles, swim, scuba dive. So all aspects of my life, it's other than reading, it's affected it greatly. Anything to do with being physical, because my lung capacity is just so diminished that once again I have no stamina.
So I know there's different classifications of COPD. Do you know how severe your
Okay, so just hopefully you were able to see just someone who had COPD talks a little bit more, but I really wanted you to, if you were able to take a look, if you were able to see as he inhaled, you could actually see more upper body movement, like in the neck and upper shoulders, and there was also, again, you may not have noticed because it went by quickly, but his breaths in terms of, he didn't sound like he was out of breath, but if you actually paid attention, his inhalations between words was more frequent than you or I. So you and I, without having any respiratory issues, would typically have more words per minute than someone who was struggling a little bit with their respiratory status. Okay, so if someone has muscular weakness, it will definitely affect their respiration. So if you think of any type of a condition or any type of an illness that affects overall muscle function, then because we use all of those muscles of respiration that you've been working on to remember, then you know that if any of those muscles or many of those muscles are impacted, then that can have an impact on your respiration. So we know that normal respiration requires good muscle effort and overcoming gravity. A condition like ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, is one where the body gradually begins to, muscles weaken all over the body and become extremely weakened. And also, if somebody is very in a weak condition like that, even posture is an issue. So you'll often see someone who has ALS who may be in a wheelchair where it has a bit of, they're not sitting straight upright, and you might notice that they have a strap on their head, or that the wheelchair is just a little bit tilted back to keep them in a more, like from tipping over. So they have, in other words, supports to help to keep them in a more upright position. And then maybe thinking about which position do you think would facilitate respiration, whether supine or semi-reclined. Which one do you think would be more helpful, and why? Finally, here are some other discussion questions that I want you to think about, and then I will ask you in class as the follow-up to this narrated lecture. So think about these questions that I have here, and just be able to reflect on those and think about those. And I can, share with you a little bit more about some of the experiences that I've had in the field. And this is definitely, if you are a medical speech language pathologist, this is definitely an area that you will see in the patients who you treat. But even if you're in an educational setting, if you're working in the schools, we have a lot more kids who are in schools with medical conditions that may be integrated into the regular classroom. And if that child has any compromise in their respiratory function, then again, that will impact their respiratory ability, but may also impact their speech function as well.